very much. The premise for a meeting for a subject is that in the past and right now, the literary sensibility of the perceptive writer has something special to contribute to understanding war and the human consequences of war. And this topic of writers in Iraq we specifically chose it as a very broad one. We wanted to allow the participants here to give their own views on different aspects of the question. For example, the quality of the writing that's been produced about Iraq, and the ways in which writers have contributed or not to the understanding of Iraq and the war there. And how, and this is a big grant that we have given to everyone, as writers, the participants in this panel perceive what has been going on there. Now, we thought that each of the participants would speak for about 8 or 10 minutes on whatever aspects of the subject that seems important to them. And we could then have an interchange of discussion and finally questions from the audience. And our first speaker is Mark Danner. Now, he teaches at Berkeley. He teaches at Bard. He's been to Iraq for the New York Review of Books twice. He's written eloquently for the New Yorker and the New York Review on war and dictatorship and democracy in different parts of the world, from Haiti to the Balkans, as well as to the Middle East. And he's written on the American elections. And his book on El Salvador and the massacre at El Mozote won the Overseas Press Club Award. He had a recent report in the New York Review on the Iraqi elections and the atmosphere in which they were conducted. And that report's been the subject of much comment on the conditions under which reporters and officials there have been working. And that report is soon to be followed by another commentary. Now, in other work, he's concentrated on one of the most controversial and disturbing aspects of the American policy concerning the Iraq War and the entire post-September 11th period. That is, the official and concealed and continuing use of torture. His writings on that question and a revealing collection of secret government documents have been collected in the book Torture and Truth. It's America and Abu Ghraib and the war in Iraq, which has been getting attention across the country. Now, he's in the process of further inquiry into this central subject. Mark Danner.
This is, I came in this morning, staggered off the red eye, and came walking in out of this bright spring day into this hall, and the first person I laid eyes on was Kanan Makiya, who was standing there near the door. And I just couldn't help remembering that, I had seen him, when was it, 90, 91, I'm not sure, we were trying to figure it out on Nightline. Gotten on the phone, I was so impressed with his eloquence and what he was saying, I'd gotten on the phone, called him up, got him over to the New Yorker, had an extraordinary conversation with him, at which point Ren Weschler swooped in, grabbed him, captured him, and did an extraordinary profile on him, something I've long since forgiven Ren for. I saw him standing there and thought, my God, how far we have come. I've just came back a couple of months ago from covering the first nationwide free elections. I'll talk about that in a second in Iraq. Kanan at the time was fighting for that very thing. And here he sits beside me, and probably there are a few other people you could cite, maybe Ahmed Shalabi, maybe a couple of others, who had more to do with the fact that Iraq just had an election, and this was something he struggled for many years. And so we're confronted immediately with the problem of the intellectual in politics and the writer in politics. Because along with the struggle to some degree triumphant, becomes the law of unintended consequences. I first came to admire his work through Republic of Fear, which he had to write under a pseudonym, Samir al-Khalil, which is an extraordinary analysis, which very much is worth reading today, of the Ba'athist state. And in it are the roots of his commitment to see Saddam and that state overthrown. Also in it is his commitment to see the Ba'athists removed entirely, the army removed entirely, and they aren't removed entirely. Indeed, they're on the street right now shooting at me, among other people. So they haven't necessarily gone anywhere, but they've changed places. Meanwhile, he's written very eloquently on the architecture, Saddam's monumental architecture, and I wrote in the last New York Review piece that Bob mentioned about the way the architecture of Iraq has changed and the look at of the city. If you go to Baghdad now, you will find a new city that's built up around Saddam's strange monumental Mesopotamian megalomania, which consists of concrete, brute gray concrete, barbed wire, Berliners, these enormous 15 to 20 foot concrete barriers which, marching alongside these avenues, have essentially wiped out huge chunks of Baghdad. You can't see it anymore. The Berliners are in front of every hotel. Jersey barriers, these concrete half barriers, tank traps, you name it, they're everywhere. And it gives the city this strange postmodern feeling of war, devastation, and certainly not democracy. And it poses, the look of the city, it seems to me, poses the same problem the election does, which is what have we wrought? And I say we, very conscious of the fact that I, together with our noble moderator, am the only American-born person up here. I go to Iraq as someone looking at, to some degree, the results of an imperial project. And I have colleagues who feel a very different way here on the podium about Iraq, who wanted the politics changed and hoped that the US could achieve that. And what we have in Iraq now, and what the writer sees, to get back to the theme of this discussion, is a very much half-finished project. A project that is a polity now that's riven with violence, an extraordinary, extraordinary level of violence. There have been getting up on 300 suicide bombings in Iraq, which have killed several thousand Iraqis. The number dead of Iraqis since the beginning of the war, something of great controversy, but it probably amounts to more than 30,000, at least more than 20,000. Other estimates go much higher than that. We're talking about a country that's a tenth the size of the United States. So if we multiply that, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people equivalent in the United States. Meanwhile, we just had an election. It was a very odd election. There was the election here and the election there. The election you saw was 80% of Iraqis turned out, everybody waving purple fingers, a lot of exultation. The election I saw was a city locked down, a city under an incredible security regime, a campaign that did not exist, not safe enough for any kind of rallies or public gatherings because they would attract suicide bombers, electoral lists that were secret, and numbers of Iraqis who voted, which was extraordinary, but below 50% of those eligible, probably. And people elected who were essentially the same 7, 8, 9 exile leaders who have been running the interim institutions of Iraq for the last year or so. And the key element in that vote, at least it seemed to me, was the people who didn't show up, which is to say the Sunnis, which is to say there's a post-war dispensation there that has not been accepted by the key party, and that is the party that is making war. I look at this in the end, I guess, as an American who, at the time when I first met Kanan, felt his project was very worthy, and when it came right down to launching a war, felt ferociously, strongly, that it was the wrong thing to do, that it would lead to a set of unintended consequences which would see, and I said this publicly at the time, a guerrilla war, and would see America's judgment in foreign affairs its ability to create a polity abroad, create a new kind of politics, severely tested. When I look in the end at what's going on in Iraq, I can't help relating it to my own experience, some of which Bob laid out in Haiti and Central America, and other places where I think of US foreign policy and US attention as kind of a very bright, glaring spotlight that shines on a place and vividly illuminates it for a short period of time. We learn about it, everybody writes about it, we learn where the capital is, we see those little maps and charts in the New York Times that tell us everything. And then at a certain point, the spotlight moves on. It moves on to something else. And that place is left, at least as far as Americans are concerned, once again in darkness. And it returns to the people who own it. And I think we're in the process now of seeing that happening in Iraq. The numbers, if you look at how Americans feel about Iraq, the numbers are very grim. 60% or so think the war was not worth fighting. 48%, according to the Washington Post, think the war has made America weaker, as opposed to 20% who think it's made it stronger. But in general, my impression is that Americans would rather not think about it, which is to say that Iraq is in the slow and inevitable process of going back to the Iraqis. And as it goes back to the Iraqis, we see the beginning of a politics there, which is, I think of it as the beginning of a new universe. You have planets being formed, constellations, there is a free press, and yet it is very dangerous to stand on the street. As a writer going there now, you have to decide whether to travel around in an armored car with security with you, with semi-automatic weapons, or whether to take your chances and go in a so-called soft car and try to be inconspicuous. I noticed recently a piece in the New York Times that was describing a suicide bombing on the holiday of Ashura. There were 5 of them that day. And it described a scene of carnage. We've all become very used to these. And then there was an odd paragraph in which it said, from a high building nearby, one could see that parts of bodies were being arranged in piles. And what struck me about this was not simply the grotesqueness of the image, because we've seen a lot of grotesque images. It was that aerial viewpoint, which is that reporter was standing in a high building nearby. Because when you see now reports on your television screen at night, and you have someone from ABC News or CBS saying, so-and-so, ABC News, Baghdad, the odds are that they're standing on the roof of a hotel and that they have not been out in the city at all that day. And there you have the beginning of a separation, which, as I say, I think is the beginning of something that's inevitable. You see that separation in the American Occupation Authority as well, in which people are in the so-called green zone and very rarely go out and see Iraqis. Iraqis come to them. They're English speaking, they're Western educated in general, they're very much for the American project, which means that the real Iraq, which is standing behind a kind of concrete veil, has become increasingly bewildering to the American occupiers. And I think those occupiers, one way or another, at some point in the near future are on their way out. The spotlight will move on, and we will all be left to contemplate, at least as Americans, what we have wrought. But no matter what we contemplate, Iraq will return to the Iraqis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Now our next speaker is Dunya Mikhail. She was born in Iraq in 1965. She published 4 collections of poetry in Arabic. She's well known among Arabic readers for her subversive, her innovative, her satirical verse and her other writings. Among her work, for example, is a lyrical diary describing such events as the destruction of the Amirah shelter by American fighter planes during the First Iraq War. She received a degree in English literature from Baghdad University. She worked as a literary editor for the Baghdad Observer. But as she faced increasing threats from Iraqi authorities, she left in the late 1990s. She studied at Wayne State. She received a UN Human Freedom Writing Award for her work on her, to immediately return to her homeland. She suffers from a dangerous virus in her heart. Dunya Mikhail.
Thank you so much, Robert Silvers. I feel honored and feel so happy. I like to thank Pan American Center, New York Review of Books for sponsoring this. Like to thank New Directions for publishing my book. Like to thank Esther Ellen. Like to thank you all that for attending, taking the time to attend. Let me start by saying that I left Iraq in 1995. So what does that mean? It means that I have witnessed the Iraq-Iran war for 8 years, and then I witnessed we had 1 year of peace as a break. Then we had the invasion of Kuwait, Gulf War, and the sanctions aftermath. And even we had a short little attack by Clinton also in 93, if you remember. So we felt like it was like a fashion. Every president, US president coming, like bombing Iraq, the father and then the son, and Clinton was like the Holy Spirit because he has only short attack. So became very familiar with the word. And every time, like, we were hiding in that room, we had a special room that my mother was preparing for us when we had preparing for the war, and she was praying always, and I always hear her saying, "God full of mercy, God full of mercy." So, and every time I was saying that, I was remembering a poet, Yehuda Mishral. He was in one of his poems. He says, "God full of mercy. If God was not full of mercy, mercy would be in the world, not only in him." So, so I witnessed these wars before I left, and so Robert was telling me the impression I got that he wanted to know what's the response of writers. I think writers should take X-rays of the catastrophe, take X-rays, and I think the best thing they can do is to turn the catastrophe from a tragic event to an aesthetical event. That's what they can do. But does literature in general, poetry, does it offer salvation? I believe no, it doesn't. It doesn't. Does it heal wounds? No, it doesn't. Actually, it keeps it open forever, the wound. Does it help the survivors? I think no, it just revealed the disaster as being a survivor with other survivors. Actually, sometimes the disaster is the only true survivor among all. Because saying I survived, you lack that final meaning of I am alive. I think that's from the experience with my colleagues and everyone. And that's a complicated story, that another thing. Also, I noticed something that I want to mention. I saw that the American people in general, not only politicians, they wanted so much to see weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They got so disappointed when they didn't find them. This is like, also reminds me of a poem by Kavavi. Kavavi's Waiting for the Barbarians. How at the end of the poem, Kavavi said, what gonna happen? What is going to happen to us without barbarians? These people were kind of a solution. So sorry that this solution was not there, But for us, the Iraqis, I think that was not the issue for us at all. We didn't care if there was that, if the existence or non-existence of these weapons, because for us, we know that for us the issue was the regime of mass destruction. That was the issue. So what I witnessed in Iraq was like what I can call maybe, if you allow me, a tsunami in slow motion. But yet, the response to that, to that man-made disaster was not as quick and helpful as the response to the nature-made disaster. I think I'm gonna save the time for questions because I have a lot, but I would like to hear from you because I don't know from where I should start, from where I should end. I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, our next speaker, and by the way, there have been some requests that the next speaker move to the podium so people can see from the back. Anyway, Mark has in effect introduced him. He has been one of the most passionate critics of the Saddam Hussein Ba'athist regime. He's been one of the strongest and most ardent advocates and most respected advocates for its removal. He was born in Baghdad in 1949. He left Iraq in 1968 to study architecture at MIT. And he comes from a family that's been deeply involved in the architectural life of Iraq. In 1989, he wrote Republic of Fear, which Mark mentioned. And it's still one of the most telling, if not the most telling, account of the brutal workings of the Saddam Hussein regime. Now, in his book, The Monument, he wrote a very original book. It's on the aesthetics of power and how it produces kitsch in Iraq and elsewhere by implication. And in his book, Cruelty and Silence, he exposed the failure to confront injustice and tyranny in much of the Arab world. Now, since the American takeover, he has been much involved in efforts to prepare a constitution protecting secularism and minority rights, and to record the atrocities of the Ba'athist regime. It's no secret that at times he's found himself in conflict with the American authorities over the support for and the extent of some of these projects. Iraqis and Americans have told me they watch very closely to see what place he will have in the new Iraq. Kanan Makiya.
Thank you, Bob and Mark, for that very generous, overly generous introduction. Thank you also to the New York Review of Books, to Ren Weschler and the Institute of Humanities for inviting me. I am really going to take the title of this panel to heart. I talk about Iraqi politics all the time, and I'm not going to do it today. I will talk about the dilemmas of writing about Iraq. Just say, my good friend Mark, I disagree with his evaluation of the meaning of the elections, and perhaps we could take that up in the question and answer period, but I'm going to choose not to do that. However, I will hopefully remain equally controversial. Let me begin by talking about the story that Mark himself has just written a very important book about, which I must immediately say I have not yet had the time to read. And it is on top of my reading list. And that is the story of the Abu Ghraib scandal, torture story, when it broke out, what is it now, about a year or so ago. Now when that story of practices of American troops in the Abu Ghraib prison first broke out, I was actually in Baghdad at the time, hunting down a particular videotape that had originated in the offices of the Iraqi Mukhabarat. And that this videotape depicted, according to our sources, which included a relative of the woman whose husband was the victim upon whom about whom the videotape was shot, and others, depicted allegedly a prominent merchant who happened to be a Tikriti being eaten alive in a pit by half-starved dogs and surrounded by a circle of men whom one could only take to be officials, important officials like this. Now, I was then, and still am, my colleagues at the Iraq Memory Foundation, which I founded in Baghdad, in the business of collecting the tapes like this. And they include, we have already shown these several times in Baghdad, very important viewing, tapes of beheadings by the Fida'in organizations. These are tapes where the regime videotapes its own people actually beheading people. Tapes of executions. They used to try out different methods of executing people, putting hand grenades in people's pockets, for instance, or a whole variety of different ways, throwing people out of high buildings. And then we have a particularly gruesome tape, which was subject of a major documentary, of the medical operation of amputating people's limbs and marking and scarring their foreheads. This was the practice that the regime began in the 1990s in relation to army deserters and the like. And it actually filmed the doctors performing these operations. We located these films, and they were used they were shown actually, obviously in Iraq, but they've also been several times, but they've also been used by filmmakers in the making of documentaries. So we were in the business of collecting these kinds of films generated, I might say, by the Iraqi authorities themselves at the time that the abuses in Abu Ghraib, the torture in Abu Ghraib, the story first broke, and the pictures that you have all now become commonplace all over the world were circulating. I tried at that moment in time to write about Abu Ghraib, the way Mark has succeeded in doing, but I failed. And it's still difficult for me to understand. I'm trying to think about why. I was paralyzed. I was sort of struck down by a kind of writer's block. Perhaps many of you have that experience. I couldn't write about the Abu Ghraib scandal. I still don't know exactly why. Of course, I was busy doing a million other things. The country was in a state of turmoil. I was on the Constitutional Committee, as Bob mentioned. So there were a lot of sort of excuses I can bring to bear. But deep down, I know it was something more than that. I was simply unable to write an article that I should have written and didn't. Now, I was perfectly situated to write this article. I spent 25 years writing about Iraq. I mean, it took 6 years to write Republic of Fear. I was I was formed and shaped politically by the 60s, the anti-war movement, Vietnam, the Palestinian movement, the whole post-67 war radicalization in the Arab world. And that absence really bothered me. It was kind of like a hole in the heart. How could she write, I said to myself, I asked myself, about the Abu Ghraib images perpetrated by the American soldiers without writing about Iraqi abuses of the barbarous nature I described, and probably, by the way, in many cases, perpetrated in the very same prison, Abu Ghraib, because that was a major center where these kinds of practices took place. Was it right, I asked myself, morally speaking, I mean, as a writer, was it right to write about the one without the other? Certainly, her essay was beautifully crafted from the point of view of its internal architecture, its internal logic, the manner of development of the argument, from a literary point of view, you might say. And perhaps it might be true, I thought to myself, that it would be very hard to have an article as beautifully constructed as that if one saw oneself as driven, morally speaking, to have to write about both kinds of tortures both kinds of abuses at the same time. There was a problem there, I felt. Certainly, let me put it this way, it was much harder or less clean to write about both of these things at the same time, because you just didn't know where you were going to go with the piece. It somehow couldn't hang together as a piece of writing, perhaps. This is, of course, a hypothesis. This is a statement. And yet, it seems to me, the harsh and brutal facts of our world is that both these sets of abuses are deeply, inextricably linked to one another, in this particular case through the Iraq War, through the place, namely the Abu Ghraib prison, and through the circumstances, the entire set of circumstances which surrounded it. The other strange paradox is that if you go about asking, as I did, ordinary Iraqis at the time of the appearance of these images about the Abu Ghraib pictures of torture that were inflicted by US soldiers, more often than not, you would get this very strange kind of answer. You would get people saying, "You call that torture? I can tell you a thing or two about torture. I have a cousin or a relative or such and such," and then would spill out into a whole story that would make your hair stand on end. That kind of a story. Now, that's a problem with that kind of a discussion. That is not to dismiss it. Some people, of course, these images struck Iraqis in all sorts of ways. They showed the United States in a whole new light. They confirmed certain people's prejudices and they unconfirmed others. They threw people into confusion. They enormously complicated everything that the Iraq project was supposed to be about. But you did have that immediate instinctive reaction. And in a country that is going through the kind of violence that Mark adhered to at the moment, violence, by the way, that is entirely explicable by the way in which the war, by what happened immediately after the war, but again, I said I wouldn't get into politics, then you get a population that hardens, that has a hardening of the arteries when it sees these pictures. Today, the toughest people in the world about the perpetrators of the abuses, the insurgents, are ordinary Iraqis. It's not the government. The government catches people with RPGs and so on and lets them out after 4 months. This infuriates the public at large. The pendulum will swing to the other side, and I fear the day when that public pressure will build up to the kinds of campaigns that we saw in other Arab countries where a hardening of the arteries and impossibility of the improving of the situation, a decline in interest in human rights takes place as a consequence of the harsh measures needed to crush the insurgents, which are certainly on the agenda in Iraq today. Anyway, come back to the main point about the Abu Ghraib business. Perhaps it is the daily concatenation, I ask myself, of contradictory, unclean, let us say unsimple facts like these that I've been mentioning that combine somehow to make it so ever so hard to write these days about Iraq. And frankly, I find it easier to act, to try to do things, even to participate in something as complicated as a constitutional committee, than to reflect upon the meaning, reflect upon the phenomenon I've just described and what they really mean, strange as it may sound. Constitution is easier than writing about Abu Ghraib, frankly. Now, I want to end on a dilemma that Edward Said put to me 12 years ago at a conference in London, very, very similar to this one, called, the title I think was Writers and the Middle East. This was taking place at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and it was just before the appearance of my book, Cruelty and Silence, which criticized my fellow Arab writers, as Bob mentioned, for their language of silence, and it was a discourse, for their discourse of silence about the atrocities perpetrated by the regimes in the Arab world, but in particular the Saddam regime. After the publication of my book, he would never have such a conversation with me again. He cut off all relations, and unfortunately things ended in a very unpleasant way. But back then in 1992, he said, with reference to my previous books on Iraq, "Kanan, writing is all about context. No one writes in a vacuum." I mean, I am, of course, I am this is not an exact literal quote, I'm paraphrasing what he said. What you write and who you write for are inextricably intertwined. Yeah, and you have to understand, he said to me, because we'd had a little tiff on the pages of some newspaper about the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. You have to understand, he said, that I write as an American, and I'm for a Western audience. And you are writing as an Iraqi, but you have published your book in the West and in English. His point was that because of what I was writing about, who I was as he saw it, I was writing in the wrong place and at the wrong time and in the wrong language. I did not accept then, and nor do I accept now, that kind of reasoning as it relates to writing in general, be it about Iraq or anything else. Nor do I accept the premise that who I am ought to have something to do with the rightness or wrongness of what I write about. I will read Mark's book without really caring about the fact that he was born in this country or in that place, etc. I think it's very important for me to be able to do that, otherwise the meaning of writing is entirely extinguished from my point of view. That having been said, however, I will say that the reality out there, the very complex, multidimensional reality of abuse out there, and of the history, the entire complex history of US-Iraqi relations over the last, 15 years? From the last Gulf War, preceding the last Gulf War, right up to now, the complexity of all that is an infinitely more complicated topic than obviously the confusing and uninteresting question of who I or Edward Said are in some sort of identity politics terms. But it is that complexity, I submit, and it's on this that I end, that finally defeats even the ability of truly great and gifted writers like Susan Sontag to write about a phenomenon like the Abu Ghraib torture. The only conclusion that I can come to from this bleak assessment is that those of us who are in the business of writing need to learn to be, it seems to me, orders of magnitude more humble about what it is we can know or achieve through this act of writing itself. And that, it seems to me, is amply demonstrated by the story of Iraq and the writer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kanan. Now, the final speaker on our symposium is
Somebody yelling at us.
a little.
Do they want the room? I think we should give it to them.
Is Pankaj Mishra, and I will say though that after he speaks, then we'll have a chance for people to talk among themselves. Now, Pankaj Mishra, he's emerged as one of the most talented and brilliant writers from India to appear in recent years. He was born in 1969. He spent his childhood in Uttar Pradesh. He worked as a reporter and a literary critic. In his first book, he drew on the experience of his own travels to write about the deep changes taking place in rural Indian towns. And then he wrote a novel, The Romantics, about the encounter of Europeans in Indian cities and Indian culture. Recently he has a book, a very impressive book to my mind, The End of Suffering, Personal Exploration of Buddhism and its history and its contemporary significance. Now, he's recently been a fellow at the Writers and Scholars Center here in New York at the New York Public Library. But particularly relevant today are the long reports and reflections he wrote for the New York Review on America's other war in Asia, the war in Afghanistan, about which he wrote after two extended visits there. In those essays, he examined some of the same workings of American military administration and some of the same contradictions between official rhetoric and reality that are pertinent to our understanding of Iraq today. Pankaj Mishra.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks also to Kanan and Dunya for giving us a very insightful view of what they feel about Iraq and being Iraqis. I think their perspective is especially relevant. I want to come back to something that Kanan said about describing his exchange with Edward Said about writing happening in a context. Writing does happen in a context, and it's something so obvious that it does not even need to be proved. But of course, that context need not become an excuse for censorship, that just because you're in the West that you should not publish certain things. But I do think that context does shape the way in which we write, the way in which we say certain things, the way in which the context creates certain ideas, certain assumptions. And I am very struck by the way in which writers outside America, outside the West, have perceived the invasion of Iraq, the aftermath, how completely different it is from the way people have perceived it here, writers have perceived it here. I mean, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, a lot of people in Europe and America would ask me, so, what do people in India, what do people in South Asia think about this? And I would always find the question slightly naive, because to me, to my mind, it was totally predictable, the answer, which was that everyone I knew, everyone I read in the papers was against it. And I think this is partly because, there's a whole generation of people who lived through colonial rule, its humiliations, and this generation is still around. They passed on their memories to other generations, and this memory has been constantly recycled through history textbooks, through films, through music. It's very much a part of what India is as a nation, and Pakistan to a large extent. And there is, this sort of great suspicion of foreigners because of this nationalist mythology. Foreigners doing terrible things to you while claiming that it's all for your own good. And it sort of runs very, very deep, this cultural suspicion. And so there's a whole demonology of people who collaborated with the British, who were at various stages sort of working for the British, who absolutely have not only no place in the national pantheon, but they are sort of just completely ostracized. And it's very unfair. And there's a lot of crudities in that whole nationalist mythology. But nevertheless, there it is, and that shapes the way a lot of people look at the world, and also the United States. The post-independence, a lot of you will recall that India was closer to the Soviet Union than it was to the United States in the Cold War. And I think by the time I grew up, and people of my generation, the writers I know, I remember growing up with this notion of the Americans supporting Pakistan during the creation of Bangladesh, during the genocide, the mini-genocide that happened in Pakistan. And I remember very vividly the effigies of Nixon and Kissinger being burned all across these little small towns. And even small sort of uneducated person would know about America and how it was doing this stuff in Bangladesh and supporting the Pakistanis. So I think the intelligentsia in India, the reaction to the invasion was pretty much uniform, which was that this is a very bad idea, this is very unsound, it's going to all end in disaster, there's going to be resistance. And the idea of resistance was, once again, nobody really examined it or just said what kind. It was just assumed that there would be resistance, that people who've enjoyed national sovereignty for 50, 60 years, countries that have had powerful, wealthy people with lots of, why would they just suddenly surrender power to a foreign nation? So it was very sort of obvious. And I remember seeing these reviews of a book by the well-known historian Niall Ferguson, which argued about the American Empire learning from the British one. And there was incredulous reviews. What does he expect that these people who sort of been running their own countries for the last 50, 60 years, and these countries have very strong middle-class nationalists. Are they just waiting to kneel before a new sort of superpower? So a lot of this reaction really did not surprise me at all, and I just sort of took it for granted that this is the way people in India would think. And also the reaction of writers in Pakistan, which supposedly the beneficiary of the United States for many decades, because there, I think the bitterness there runs even deeper because of the American support to the General Ziaul Haq and the Islamists in general during the anti-Soviet jihad, which really kind of ravaged, Pakistan's civil society. It empowered fanatics and ideologues, and sort of within the army, within the intelligence establishment, these people were running the government, running the state, and led to the Pakistan's disastrous meddling in Afghanistan, led it to support the Taliban. And then, of course, once this anti-Soviet jihad ended, the Americans abandoned Pakistan. So there is this great sort of sense of bitterness there among the establishment, among the intelligentsia, among the writers, that we were just used to wage this jihad, and then we were abandoned. And so, there is this natural suspicion of the United States, which would not get much credit if it were to claim that we are here to create democracy, we are here to create democratic institutions. Now, this, what I'm trying to sort of really define is a kind of certain worldview, a set of assumptions, shaped by a particular historical experience, which is the experience of colonialism, of middle-class nationalism, that really shape the thinking of people there in that part of the world on very crucial issues. So nobody, for instance, I didn't see a single piece in the Indian press which said, or which supported the view that the Americans were promoting democracy in the Middle East by this invasion of Iraq. At the same time, I'm struck here in England and America by the power and influence of a sort of certain kind of Cold War mythology. And you tend to think writers are immune to this because writers have literary sensibilities that kind of transcend these parochial nationalist ideas or these sort of national myths. But the idea that the West represented, values of liberalism and democracy against communist totalitarianism, this has become, especially after the end of the Cold War in 1989, such a sort of dominant orthodoxy. And I found it I looked up the Library of America volumes on the reporting from Vietnam, and you have Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, Norman Mailer, Francis Fitzgerald. I don't think any of them says at any point that this is a war, the war in Vietnam, is being fought for with very good reasons, that we are fighting for freedom and democracy. It just happens to be going wrong, and that we should be doing this. They rejected the war, I think, almost in its entirety, not just its justification, but not just, and also the way it was being conducted, that it's all together, the rejection of the war is of peace. Whereas I've seen much more ambivalence about the response of writers, certain writers, certain analysts to the Iraq war. And some of it, I think, has to be blamed on the way the media reported on the nature of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, and that has been examined in great detail by Mike Massing and other people. But I think there is a danger, of course, that writers, living in these middle-class societies, the experience that they are being given is being mediated by these journalists out there who, as Mark pointed out, sometimes never leave the hotel, and it's the picture you're getting is not necessarily an accurate one. So it's always very dangerous to build then arguments for going to war or write an opinion piece in the press based on some of these reports. It's just, and I think the Iraq war has proved just how risky that whole venture is. But there's always been, there's also been some very good magazine journalism. But at the same time, what has puzzled me, that the number of people in the press who accepted the war as necessary, inevitable, and saw that the Bush administration was going to go ahead with it, but nevertheless wanted it to be fought for their own reasons, and they were competing sometimes to come up with better reasons for going to war and saying, well, the Bush administration is not actually coming up with the right reasons. We have the better arguments. There's a liberal argument for a case of war, for going to war. And maybe Tony Blair is presenting it much better than George Bush's. And David Hare, the English playwright, responded to that by saying, well, Americans provide the firepower and we provide the bullshit. But also what strikes me is that writers who are now in their 50s, who probably too young during Vietnam, who lent their voices to various left-wing causes in the 80s during the Cold War, some of these were willing to be what the English commentator Simon Jenkins called laptop bombers. There were people, I wouldn't like to name them here, but people saying, well, I'm very disappointed that there's a humanitarian argument to be made, and I was very disappointed the government never made it. And I think history has offered us this chance to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And there's a very strong liberal argument. A war of liberation might just be one worth fighting. And this is an argument that ought to appeal to leafy-livered, bleeding-heart liberals, according to one sort of major writer. Now, I think this sort of argument that the Bush administration would go to war fighting really on your behalf, for your reasons, and the nature of war, the writerly imagination of war, where does that come in this? When the bombs fall, the Iraqi victim of that bomb in Baghdad, would that victim find it easier to deal with her grief, to deal with her loss, by knowing that somebody out there has made a better argument for her suffering than, say, Dick Cheney? This sort of easy set of assumptions that, the United States military will become the savior of these supposedly benighted people living in this hell that is Iraq. And this whole idea, once again, it seems to me this is sort of a remnant of this whole mythology of the Cold War, that there is this, freedom and democracy we are supporting. And of course, that even during the Cold War, that idea would not have sort of borne sustained examination. You just had to look around in Asia or Africa or Latin America to see the number of right-wing dictatorships that were being supported. But now, for some reason, after the end of the Cold War, there's sort of whole triumphalist idea that we are really here to promote this, and that we should be all supporting this, of course, these ventures into the world. And very little sense, I feel, of really the limitations of brute force. Brute force can of course destroy things, but what can it actually build? And I felt, the whole sort of writers commenting the war, I've personally felt them quite marginal to the larger debate, because the choices have been made. It's a false choice that we're being asked that, are you going to let Saddam stay in power? Are you going to keep on, let him keep on torturing people? Because the decision had already been made to go to war. We were debating these choices, which were really not choices. The choices had been made, and not by people debating on the op-ed columns. And I think the voices of people with specialized knowledge, such as academics who really specialize in the Middle East or write about the Arab world, they have, I think, barely been heard in the mainstream media. Except for those academics who supported the war, and they've been very visible. And I saw a piece in the magazine, The American Scholar, which actually doesn't do those kinds of pieces, but by an academic called Lawrence Rosen, which came, I think, closest to explaining in very clear prose just who the Iraqis are, how they perceive the world, what the relationship is to Islam, and to the institutions of the modern world. All of these very interesting ideas of the kind that were explored, say, in Fire in the Lake, Francis Fitzgerald's book. Just who are the Vietnamese? What is their history? How do they relate to the world? And this kind of examination, of the mistaken assumptions, the mistaken prejudices that underpin American policy in Vietnam, and now underpins American policy in Iraq. Once again, I mean, there is no real attempt to examine those assumptions. You know, what kind of democracy? What is the relationship of Iraqis to the institutions of the modern world as they have developed in the West? You know, what is, of course, even things like democracy, which has become such an empty word. And I mean, I remember there's only one piece I remember of a writer called John Berger, very famous at one time, who wrote about democracy, just sort of one paragraph, which I'm going to read and end with that, about what that was. I think that's probably the only writerly examination of that concept. And he wrote, democracy is a proposal rarely realized about decision making. It has little to do with election campaigns. Its promise is that political decisions be made after and in the light of consultation with the governed. That is dependent upon the governed being adequately informed about the issues in question and upon the decision makers having the capacity and will to listen and take account of what they've heard. Democracy should not be confused with the freedom of binary choices, the publication of opinion polls, or the crowding of people into statistics. These are its pretense. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad we all agree on everything in here. Well, I couldn't agree more with the fact that we are all prisoners of our context. We're prisoners of our nationality and our particular history, as Pankaj described so well. And we're prisoners also, I think, of our personal histories. You know, I was thinking as Pankaj was speaking about why did I think the war was a terrible idea? And when I think about that and try to delve into it, I mean, I actually form part, arguably, of a group of writers who wrote about Bosnia, who strongly supported intervention in Bosnia, so-called liberal interventionists. And yet I was strongly against this intervention in Iraq. And I think probably the main reason, if I'm honest with myself, is because I spent a lot of time covering a place called Haiti, which has little to do with Iraq, except that it had a long-time totalitarian dictatorship. And I did first piece as a very young writer in 1986 called Haiti's Transition to Democracy. That was however long, almost 20 years ago. And I had a keen appreciation for how difficult it is to try to change a country that's undergone this kind of political trauma. Political trauma is very often the expression of some underlying political struggles or political imbalances, which I think is the case with Haiti certainly, but also the case with Iraq, and it caused me to be very, very skeptical. Pankaj pointed to a deeper phenomenon, I think, which is that, you know, there is an imperialist gaze, and we as Americans all have it. And I tried to indicate that with the metaphor of the spotlight, that we are looking out at them, and sometimes the object stares back, to use the title of an art book I like. And it stares back, and the people on whom we're acting have to know more about us than we know about them. And we tend to move on and change their lives very, very materially. I think the debate that he described, Pankaj that is, was much more complex, certainly in this country, about whether to go to war or not. But I do agree that in the end it wasn't intellectuals in the op-ed pages that determined that, and that to a large extent, my view is that many intellectuals were in effect used by the administration for its purposes, and many of them now feel betrayed. If we look at what's happened in Iraq, I mean, I finished my remarks by saying that it's going back to the Iraqis, and the spotlight will move on. The question is, if we shine it on ourselves, how have we changed? I didn't mention Abu Ghraib. Kanan talked about it intensively, although he said charmingly that his remarks were not about politics, which I admired. When we look at Abu Ghraib, and I use the word Abu Ghraib, or the phrase Abu Ghraib, to indicate a much larger collection of acts and moral concerns in the end than just what happened at Abu Ghraib prison. I'd like to make a couple points. One is that no one, I've talked to an awful lot of Iraqis about Abu Ghraib, and no one has had the reaction that Kanan described, that, you know, are you kidding? You show me, that's not torture, I'll show you torture. I've never heard that, which may also say that we're imprisoned by our context, in that people react to us in their own individual ways depending on what they want to hear. I've heard again and again the appalled reactions of Iraqis and the feeling of confirmation about a brutal occupation through those photographs. But the second point I'd like to make about Abu Ghraib is that we will be left with that, and it isn't just a set of photographs, it's a set of practices that are approved by the American government at the highest levels. The documents confirming this we have, they're public. The approval of methods of torture, including waterboarding, that go way back in history, and that are explicitly approved by our government. Guantanamo, which is an offshore prison that essentially violates the, among other things, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1675, the British Parliament passed. It's a way to get beyond the notion of government accountability for holding people prisoner. And now, was this because of Iraq solely? No, it wasn't. It was, I think, in reaction to, or as a result of, a particular reaction by a particular administration at being attacked on September 11th. And Americans, and this goes back to the question of context, I think, have a history of reacting to things in a particular way. That is, and this goes to Pankaj's comments about the Cold War, we tend to make of all evil and all difficulty one large evil that we can then go out, a big dragon that we can then go out and slay. That's what Harry Truman did in the Truman Doctrine. That's what George Bush has done. I see in the front row Paul Berman here, who did an extraordinary book called Liberalism and Terror, which is essentially the elaboration of this idea that terrorism represents an ideology heir to fascism, heir to communism. It's yet another ideology that to which America must oppose freedom, and it must go out and slay this ideology. I think this is a grave mistake, and I think the facts contradict it. But if we look around us at the consequences, I think the major consequences for Americans won't really be Iraq. It'll be a set of practices that have become instituted in our lives, that are even now going on in Guantanamo, Bagram Air Base, and places in Iraq. Because I've been spending my time interviewing interrogators, they're still going on. They're approved by the American government. And they represent a strong turn away from the values that we think, however much we've violated them in the past, that we think are absolutely intrinsic to what we are as Americans. And I think this will be, in the end, our context, this will be what we are left with. It won't be the videotapes of what happened to Iraqis in Abu Ghraib. It'll be what Americans have been led to do and are continuing to do because of the way they met the attacks of 9/11.
Well, now, I think that Kanan should have a chance to put forward his own view.
Well, I'll agree. There's so much here to talk about. I'll pick up on two remarks. One, Pankaj used the term resistance movement, that somehow or another what is going on inside Iraq, which we call the insurgency, so-called insurgency, is some sort of genuine resistance movement. And the idea that somehow this harkens back to genuine national liberation movements that are somehow resisting foreign colonialism. And this is, I'm sorry to say, I mean, this is really not at all, has no bearing whatsoever on what's going on inside Iraq. The so-called insurgency is overwhelmingly, we now know for factually the case from all sorts of documents, from their own statements, from statements being made on Iraqi TV, from in the hundreds they've been coming out, there are even confessions coming out day after day. This is manned and run by former members of the security services of the Ba'ath regime. Tens of thousands of men in the middle echelons who were not caught or captured or questioned immediately after the fall of the regime. What we're really looking at in the case of the insurgency is a war, the war that was never fought in March and April 2003. There was no war. Iraqis did not fight, let's face it, in 2003. Now there is a fight. There is the equivalent of a civil war. These people are the former thugs, the former policemen, agents of the regime, who are whose lives are at stake, whose they perhaps through depacification, demilitarization, felt threatened. Whether or not those were right or wrong policies, I'm perfectly prepared to talk about them, criticize even my own positions as to how exactly they should have been handled. I'm ready to do that. But this is not some sort of resistance movement to American occupation. The barbarism of these tactics are proof enough. Their targets are the people of Iraq, for God's sake. I mean, the 120 people were blown up in a Shiite mosque, and then, we have some sort of people turned furiously. The perpetrator was a Jordanian suicide bomber, and the Iraqis turned out, demonstrated in front of the Jordanian embassy. Their relations were cut between Jordan and Iraq. The Iraqis were furious at what was going on. In the meantime, the family of the man in Jordan had a party for the martyr. And this shows you the enormous gulf in rhetoric that has taken place between Iraqis and other Arabs, and might I say so, between a way of thinking that belongs to the past, which is this idea that we're dealing here with some sort of resistance, and something new that is going on. Well, the phenomena that we ought to be trying to grasp in, right or wrong, it's got nothing to do with the rights or wrongs of the war. There is something fundamentally new that happened. This is not a continuation of Vietnam and so on. Something new happened in Iraq. And the question to ask ourselves is, are Iraqis better off because of the fall of the regime or not in the long run? I mean, they're not materially better off, that is to be sure. They have these bunkers and these concrete barricades, to be sure. But are they better off? This is a country that now has a hope where it did not have before. It has a chance of a future. It may mess it up, to be sure. Mark's comments imply that it will. But give it time before you rule out of court up front in advance that they're going to fail, that they're going to collapse into civil war and insurgency. And if it doesn't work, if 3 to 5 years from now we're sitting at this very table and talking about the beginnings of some sort of a success story, improvement, a growth, the entry of the Kurds into Iraqi politics, the entry of minorities in ways that never happened before, these would be really an important step forward. Still, they do not justify the war. They do not yet argue that. A different discussion has to be had. For God's sake, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater by recourse to all this language that belongs to a different era and a different time. That's my main comment.
What about you, Dunya? Do you have...
Well, I heard that you, when you introduced me, Robert, you read the beginning of my poem that was inspired by Abu Ghraib, An Urgent Call. And
yeah.
I heard here my friends, Mark, you talked about it, and Kanan said it was interesting that he said this is not torture, and
I didn't say
because
it's not
compared,
torture.
you said
It's torture. It's torture.
You said compared to the.
I didn't. I said it's torture.
Okay. Well, sorry. I mean, what I understood is that you didn't consider it like an issue, like a major. Let's say.
It was such a difficult issue, I couldn't write about it. That's how difficult
it
was.
Well, my reaction was, let me be honest with you. I cannot hide my surprise. I was surprised to see Abu Ghraib. Not that I've never seen that before. I mean, I agree with you, Kanan. I mean, well, you said no, you didn't say, but I agree with what you didn't say. That in Iraq, I mean, what was done in Iraq, the real torture in Iraq, I mean, that was the real torture. But still, I was surprised, and to the point that I wrote this poem because I don't expect that from Americans. Because I thought that Americans went there to teach Iraqis some democracy. I didn't know that they'll learn some nasty practices from Iraqis, instead. So I cannot. I was disappointed and surprised because don't expect these things from Americans. That's about Abu Ghraib. About the what's mentioned as a resistance movement, I don't like to call it resistance. It's insurgency, and we understand why. I mean, these are people that their interests were attacked. Some of them, well, I think there are different groups that they have interests that are in common, and they find this common ground. Some of them, they come from outside the country. They have certain goals, and some inside Iraq that were, members of the previous regime and the Ba'ath Party. So they feel that they are threatened. So it is. I don't call it resistance. It's not really. I mean, in the Arab media, we Iraqis, and I share this with many colleagues and friends and many Iraqis, we get so mad when we read in the Arab media that they talk about what they call resistance. We feel, oh my God, this is not resistance. I mean, I don't think this is resistance at all. If that's the issue that that you want to
Now,
discuss.
Pankaj, we have various issues, and you can...
Absolutely. Well, I have to clarify. I was using the word resistance in a very fairly neutral way, in the sense that if somebody, a foreign power, say Iran, were to invade New York City, I think it would be natural to say there will be resistance. People will resist. Now, what the nature of that resistance, of course, we can talk about it till the cows come home. But I think it does strike me as very strange that here is a country which produces, on an average, of 5 to 6 suicide bombers every day, people willing to kill themselves. Not even Palestine, which has now lived through 20, 30 years of occupation, produces that many suicide bombers. The degree of hatred and despair that produces these people, I'm sure there are Al-Qaeda recruiters there, there are all kinds of fundamentalist outfits there, egging people on, organizing them. But at the same time, I think just to say that it's these remnants of the old regime or the former Ba'athist Party, what are they fighting for? The big boss is in prison. He's writing romance novels now. There's no chance of him getting back to power. And what are they so keen on that they are willing to kill themselves every day if they are only fighting to regain their power? How do they see themselves doing it? I think there's something else going on, and maybe 10, 15 years down the line we'll have a clearer picture of what this resistance consisted of. But I don't think it's terribly controversial to say that when a nation that's enjoyed sovereignty for a while, freedom from foreign interference, foreign occupation, that when it is invaded, there are some people who resist, and that's what I really meant.
Well, now, each of us has, I think, put forward a position, and I think we can have some questions. Here, we have one right here.
I was surprised that when
I
you...
think you better get up and talk louder.
it's a very short question.
There's a
so you can
microphone
repeat it.
behind. There's a microphone behind.
It's going to take me longer to get to the mic than ask the question. But I was very surprised, Markiya, when you said that Americans are on the way out, Iraqis are going to take over, because the two big obstacles to that are, of course, oil and the military bases that we want to create. So.
Thanks for that question. It allowed me to clarify. I certainly didn't mean that literally. The Americans are going to be there for quite a long time. I meant that as far as a political matter, this has become, America has had its chance, I think, to shape Iraqi politics and to shape the aftermath. And the forces that are, and Kanan may disagree with this, but I think that the forces that are starting to take hold there are predominantly Iraqi, and it may indeed devolve into a much more violent civil war. It could, the government that is struggling to form itself right now could gain added legitimacy. They could make a deal with the Sunnis. It's quite possible. Many of the Sunni groups, by the way, who have links, these are public political groups like the Iraq Islamic Party and others, who have links to the insurgency. I mean, this is not just a floating bunch of violent people. They have a political public face. But you make the point about bases. That is going to be a major concern of the interim government and eventually, I suppose, the permanent government, the Americans were very adamant about us insisting that the government that is being formed now will be able to agree to foreign treaties, that is, bases, with only a majority vote. And the book that's coming out by Larry Diamond called Squandered Victory, very interesting book about the occupation. He worked for Bremer, goes into this in depth. It's clear that the administration wants to leave American bases there, and it will be interesting to see how the politics evolve and whether that will be possible for a Shia-dominated government. But anyway, Americans will be there for a long time. The question is whether they'll be the driving force in Iraqi politics, and I think that era is ending.
No, I agree with you.
Well, now we have it right in the front row, and would you mind going to the microphone? There's one over here.
Two questions, one very short, one a little longer. Both Kanan and Dunya, Kanan said and Dunya alluded to a rift between Iraqis and the rest of the Arab world. I'm wondering if you could explicate that a little bit, and of course, the rest of the Arab world also not being a monolith, but how each of you sees that. And also my very practical question is, are any of the newspapers now being published in Iraq available in English, and can we read them?
Would you like to start with that?
Yeah, about the.
Sorry.
We noticed, this event of the war and the change, the historical curve, whatever you want to call it, in Iraq. The response, we've been like tracing the media in Arabic, the media in the Arab world, let me say, and we got so disappointed with. Especially in the beginning. Now there's some change though. In the beginning, they were talking about, the issue was invasion, resistance, and here's maybe also America's fault, because they called it occupation, invasion, and some friends were wondering why, these are negative terms. So you already, you are, naming it, you're labeling it already with negative terms that gives this chance to whoever wants to interpret it this way. But and in the Arab, in the newspapers like Al-Quds Al-Arabi and other newspapers, they were talking about this resistance and glorifying it. In the beginning of aftermath the war, but after that, I noticed now recently that the tone has changed a little bit. For some reason, I don't see that.
It's true.
Yeah, I don't see that recently. For some reason, maybe because the Arabs also are seeing that Iraqis have been. Iraqis wanted to say to Arab people, "Well, leave us alone. We've been suffering, and you were watching." We were not helping. You were glorifying Saddam, praising Saddam. We had these big festivals, poetry festivals. Arab writers were coming to Iraq, and they were praising Saddam, and we were listening to them and not saying anything. But they were not supporting people. They were not knowing what's going on. Iraqis were suffering, but so Iraqis, they had this. I see that there's this tendency now, they call themselves Iraqi nation. They don't want to be part of the Arab nation now. I'm talking about journalists, writers. I don't know. I didn't go to Iraq yet after the 95. I don't know how the street. I watched some films. I read. I called my friends on the phone. So I'm not sure of the full image, but the image I have is basically from some friends and journalists and writers in Iraq that I have a contact with. They want to be separated from the Arab nations. They say enough, and we are the Iraqi nation, they call themselves. Now there's this change in the media. That's how I see it. I would like to know what Kanan.
Let's have a comment from Kanan.
I'm actually leaving 6:30 to catch a plane to go to Dubai. For the first time in my life, I'm meeting the Director General of Al Arabiya Station to air 50 films of Iraqi victims of torture and abuse under Saddam, which we've made at the Iraq Memory Foundations, interviews one-to-one, Holocaust Museum style, interviews, which for the first time, Arab media, I have a chance, it's not going to happen, it's not definite, so it's not, don't anybody write this as though it's going to happen, it's just, we're sitting down seriously to discuss the possibility of airing on a weekly basis one of these films. The idea that I was the great big black sheep, the idea that they even entertained the possibility of airing these films all the way across the Arab Muslim world is a revolution. You mentioned Quds al-Arab. This is the Arab nationalist rag of the Arab world. This is the most vehement, the most vicious, the most anti-American, anti-science rhetoric day in, day out. This newspaper published a poll on its internet asking its readers through its internet site, what do you think about the Iraqi elections? The Iraqi elections, the question was exactly yes or no, answer simply. Do you think the Iraqi elections are good for the Arab world? Yes or no. They had 300,000 responses, 90% of which said, we think it's a good event. This is a sea change. This is not a reason to go to war, I go back. But you have to have some sense that there are important changes afoot here. This, days when after 1993, Cruelty and Silence, nobody would talk to me. This was the same Quds al-Arabi would publish the most unbelievable attacks and so on. This is a change. In Lebanon today, you have Walid Jumblat sounding like a neoconservative. You have large numbers of Lebanese thinking of inviting the Iraq Memory Foundation for a big event. We discuss how we want to talk about how Iraq is going to deal with their settler accounts with their past, because we Lebanese are thinking about now we have to come to terms with our civil war, 15 years, etc. Now this is new. This never happened before. And it's not the beginning, it's not democracy, it's not the end of the thing, but it's the beginning of something very important. And anybody who knows the logjam, the dead end of that this part of the world was in, and doesn't see in this the seeds of something new, at least, it may take 10, 20 years to develop, is really not reading the situation right.
Now, I think I should ask this gentleman in the middle, Yeah, if others have questions, why not line up over there? We'll just save time. At least we can have 4 or 5.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about language and writing and writers, and I'd like to move back just a little bit from the immediacy of the political situation, with all due respect. I was very moved by the self-revealing of being unable to write about something that was so important. The English language is being destroyed, in my view, by the misuse and distortion of words that had value, and the rhetoric that is being used, and it's being reinforced and reinforced by technology, satellite television, which is all over the world. And I wondered, in other languages, are these words being destroyed in the same way that we are experiencing them here? And how, as writers, do you take that moment to reflect and think rather than react to the latest atrocity, whatever it may be, at whatever level?
Good. Would you like to say something about that? I think it's addressed to anyone who wants to.
Well, obviously all of these words mean something completely different, like democracy or freedom. And I mentioned this essay in The American Scholar, which talks about the notion of political freedom. What does that consist of? And these concepts, they're always being shaped by experiences. And obviously none of them remain constant. So what the word democracy means in a context like Iraq or the Middle East is something very different from what it means in a place like India or indeed Nepal, which I've just visited, where there is this great felt need for democracy, and yet nobody seems to be able to come up with a workable definition of what that democracy might be. And there are these broad ideas, something to do with elections, let's have elections, but they've had many elections in the last 10, 15 years, and that hasn't solved anything. Some would say that it's actually created more problems, having all these elections, having all these profusion of political parties. So it's sort of these, I think, experiences being so specific to each context I don't think we can actually have universal, and that's where there's something quite hubristic about this project of exporting democracy, because it really just the word, the concept just means different things in different places, and you just have to try and understand what it means in that particular context. And for that, you really have to understand historically those particular cultures, their political cultures, all of these things before you start, going off on these foreign adventures.
Now, does anyone want to comment on that?
I think, just so very quickly, ours, namely the Arabic language, was still in a very romantic, flowery phase. That is beginning to change. I really appreciate Dunya's comments on that. I sense a change. For instance, the poem, important, foundational as it is to the Arab word, Arab writing, is giving way to the essay, to the text, to the novel. And a new kind of very descriptive writing is emerging. That's a sense. I'm not an expert in the field, but it suggests, to speak to the gentleman, a different kind of transformation of language that is taking place. I very much expect that to continue to go on. I'm thinking, for instance, of a novelist like Hassan Dawood. I don't know if you know the Lebanese novelist. He writes in a way that is utterly unbombastic, utterly without the usual flourishes that have worked so well all through the 70s and 80s and 90s in the Arab world, to where the mastheads of the Pan-Arab, the Ba'ath Party champion that kind of language. But it is so this other kind of language is now sneaking in. Would you agree, Dunya?
To some extent.
Good. We'll have another question.
My question is regarding the Iraqi elections, and Mr. Danner spoke about it, and I thought touched on two important details. One is that he seemed to imply that the mood was not as euphoric as the Western press has told many of us, and secondly, that it was perhaps less revolutionary than we thought, as it was a recycling of the same exile leaders, which is to an extent true. I was hoping the two Iraqi participants could address those 2 points based on their contacts and knowledge of the situation.
Could you try, having said that, to formulate a question? What do you
Yes, could the two Iraqi participants of our panel please address the ideas that the elections were conducted with the elections were less revolutionary than many of us are led to believe, and discuss the true mood of the Iraqi people toward the elections based on their knowledge.
As much as I'm concerned, I went and I participated in the elections myself, and I had my finger, was painted, and that was so exciting to me. From here, I mean, I had my friend who's fiction writer. I asked her, I called her, and I said, "Are you going to the elections? Just be careful." Because they were, those insurgents were threatening people. Thanks God, not major, accidents happened. But my friend said, "No, I'm going to Jordan." She said, "I'm going to Jordan because of the election." I said, "Why? You shouldn't." She said, "No, because I'm afraid, I'm scared, and this and that." And she has a baby, and they went to Jordan. But then, when she was in Jordan, she had more problems. It seems she had more problems going back to Iraq. She faced problems. I mean, how she couldn't enter, without. She was looted, and I don't know this and that. And she said, "I wished if I just stayed. I even wish if I went to the elections." But the image like we saw on the TV, I was not there. But what I saw on the TV, people in the north of Iraq dancing, and people, I think they said 60% went for elections. I mean, that's a big percentage. So my husband and I were happy with this, but then my husband mentioned something. He said, "But you know what? I think most of them for religious purposes, because somebody in Friday had preached, and he said, go to elections and somebody that they trusted, I mean, religious figure, and most of them, that followed that. I said, okay, sometimes religion, can have, good impacts, I mean, like that. So it seems it's the beginning. I mean, I call it number even 0, not number 1. So to have in elections, it has been for first time in the history of Iraq. I mean, we are not used to that. So it's I think it turned out not bad.
So you were there, were you not?
I was not there during the actual those weeks, just before. But the elections were, were an utterly transforming moment. 7,000 odd individuals put themselves forward on slates, 100 odd slates. True, everybody was confused. Mark is right in that respect. But so what, for God's sake? These people are entering politics for the first time. They're like children in swaddling clothes. They're learning to walk for the first time. What do you expect? It was a remarkable experience. Not only has nothing like this happened in Iraq in 50 years, nothing like this has happened in the Arab world in 50 years. All elections in this part of the world are totally orchestrated, state-managed things that come from the down top, in which the results are always rigged to 1 degree percentage point or another. Everybody knows what the results are. Even the Egyptian government has had to back down because of the demands to have at least a proper leadership contest, as opposed to the rigged thing where the son of Mubarak would end up being nominated. That whole dream of his son coming there is gone. The elections set these people in motion. True, there was not enough information. The lists were not known, but you had to go out and see the posters out there and the new colors that have been introduced in the language of the parties as they tend to talk to people. It's not perfect. It's it's the first time anybody does it, but it was a remarkable moment. And you can say many things about those elections. You can talk about the failures here and there in that locality or the other, and in the Sunni provinces. You can talk about intimidation. They're all true, but nonetheless, 8 million, what was the number? 8 million people went out, walked with their children and with their babies off, and stood in lines. 17 polling stations were attacked, but they were foiled. The Iraqi police, for the first time, behaved like a real police, fought back, stood firm. This was a new kind of stiffening of the resolve of the old security forces, which the Americans could never bring about, but which the elections brought about. So this is important.
Could I say a word about that? By all means. I completely agree that the elections were an important event. There's no question about that. I was trying to point out the difference between the way they were perceived here and the way they were there, because I was there, and I don't think Kanan was there. Neither of you were there, and you can talk about how transforming and electrifying they were, but if you weren't there, it's a somewhat limited view on what actually happened. And I wanted to make a few points. One is that though there were these enormous numbers of lists, there were actually 4 lists. All of these lists were irrelevant because nobody knew who they were. The names weren't known. They were irrelevant. You had 4 lists. One was the Kurdish list, which was essentially funded by the Kurdish government in the north, consisted of these people who had run Kurdistan for the last 20-odd longer years. The second was the Shia list, which was approved by Sistani, who had said, as Dunya said in the mosques, go out and vote for me, it's your religious duty. And all the other Shia clerics said the same. And the third was the Alawi list, which was essentially, he was running the interim government backed by the Americans. And I'm not saying this was not important, it was an important event, absolutely. But it was not a transforming event in the sense that basically the elections gave a degree of legitimacy to the politicians who had been the interim leaders. They have now lost a good deal of it by taking so long and failing to form a full government up to now. So, this is the realm of politics. It's not, I think, to go back to these words that somebody asked about democracy and so on, Pankaj said they mean different things to different people. We should think a bit about what they mean to us. Because to us, that is as Americans, they're kind of a talisman. We say democracy, democracy, democracy is sweeping the Middle East. And the assumption there is that a war was necessary, an occupation. It is an occupation, an invasion. It is an invasion. That word, there's nothing, if a foreign army comes into a country and conquers it and runs it, that's called an invasion and an occupation. That's just what the words mean. The idea that Mubarak would finally say, okay, somebody can run against me, while still ruling by emergency decree, by the way, and changing none of the Constitution and none of his control of the media and all the rest, The idea that that took an invasion of Iraq is just insane. The American government supports that government with $3 billion a year. A lot of these changes, another one was the death of Arafat, which led to the Palestinian elections, which presumably the US was not behind, although some Palestinians think otherwise. And some of the other changes, the death of Hariri in Lebanon, all of these things certainly have some degree of reliance on the fact that the US is now pushing for democracy in the Middle East. I completely agree with that, although the degree of reliance you can talk about. The fact is, though, how much did that have to do with the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which is a project that has been fraught with enormous difficulties, a great deal of death, and the future of which we can not now estimate at this point. That seems to me to be the question.
Now, we have another question.
I'd like all four of the panelists to talk about the traditional view of women in Iraq versus a more modern view of women. And I say this partly because of I've noticed that there are traditional women, Sistani line women, that are participating in the parliament, and that they want a government that is traditional. And then I'd like to have that related to the attitudes of this new government toward Iran.
That's quite a question about, but the major thing is women, and I think you should start.
Okay.
And then
Yeah, I want to mention something that about the situation of Iraqi women compared to other women in the Middle East. The situation is really unique because of the experience that they lived. During the Iraq-Iran war for 8 years, I'm gonna try to be brief, but this long story, I'll make it in brief. The war, in the absence of men being soldiers in the front, women, Iraqi women they depended upon Iraqi women to do the jobs of men, so they were encouraged to be, they became more educated, they were more responsible, they were having jobs that are like even boss and doing everything needed in the country. And in Iraq, they don't usually import people from outside, people to work. They depend on their people, so depended on women. So Iraqi women became, during the Iraq-Iran war, really maybe you got the image, educated, hardworking, and they were, taking care of the family. Then after that, after the Gulf War, sanctions were imposed on Iraq, and because of the sanctions, there was this shortage of food and supplies and everything. So again, women here, and the way that the family in Iraq, woman is the person who should take care of the table of food and everything. So, she was trying to, she was the one who was concerned and, responsible feeding the children, the family. And again, husbands were outside working maybe the whole day to earn living because of dinar was down, and men had to work, even those who came from, they came from the war and they had to work double times now to earn living. And women were sometimes, helping, even those who were not working before, now they started to work because of this economic crisis, the sanctions. So women became suddenly, powerful, educated in Iraq. The type of woman, I don't think very traditional. Only maybe in the south of some parts of south of Iraq, they were wearing the veils, and not very common. Not many women were wearing the veil in Baghdad by that time. My impression after I left in '95, after that time, now I noticed that the matter of being, they became more and more religious, the Iraqi women. Why? Because these continuous crisis and wars, and the authority being that kind of oppressing authority, they lost, they needed kind of another authority. They relied more on God because they couldn't trust anymore, I mean, anybody. I mean, nobody's, something is helpless there. So my impression that they relied more to the authority of God. And there was during, Saddam also had something called Al-Hamla al-Imaniya, which is the, what we call it, like religion campaign. Faith campaign. Because I remember that, I even had that before I left. He had a campaign called Faith Campaign, where he wanted to win the Arab world by presenting himself as a religious man. He was not truly religious, but he wanted to, play on this card. He had lost some cards, and now he found this card to play. So he launched that, and of course, you see that more clear on women than on men, because now they have to, to cope with religion, Islamic religion. Maybe, I mean, even you have to wear the hijab, the veil, and other things. And this is becoming long, sorry, but what I wanted actually to say is that I saw that when I called, many women wear veil, those who you don't expect that to wear veil after these crises. So the situation is unique. Now what's going on these days, I mean, now these people, each one now is playing, they cry for their own interest and their slogans, and some by force, some, so the situation is, I'm concerned, to tell you the truth. I'm concerned about this, the issue of women now, how things will, and I'm waiting, and I want to also know how the Constitution will deal with that. There was law, I think 132 or something. The law was terrible law, and I'm glad that is not there. But I'm just concerned. I don't want to see that law in the Constitution. So like you, I'm waiting to see what will happen.
System. So this is one of the struggles that's going on. It has to do with very specific issues of law, as Kanan pointed out, inheritance, how much the legal testimony of women is valued, whether it's a percentage of that of men, and so on. And those things are going on right now, quite apart from what the changing role of women that Pankaj talked about, particularly in the South. This is going to be fought out in very loud terms in writing the Constitution.
I think we have time for just two more, and perhaps we could do it briefly.
This is a question for Dunya Mikhail. It's a question about your poem America, and it's full of pathos and irony about this country and sort of the disposable nature of pop culture in America. Did you write it with any audience in mind, with America or Iraq, and how has your reaction to that poem been by Arabs and Americans? I know you live in Detroit, and also Arab Americans.
Right. This is my longest poem, by the way. I wrote it from the viewpoint of an immigrant. I mean, because when I came in the airport, they took a lot of pictures of me, and they took my fingerprints, and I waited for a long time. So I was surprised. Do they know I'm so famous, or am I a terrorist, or what is going on? I mean, it took a long time to cross the border. That was the first thing, and then they had long questions and all this, and I was just an innocent human being. So it was inspired by my experience. It says, I think I'm glad. I mean, what did you see it in?
How did you get the line "I want it free"?
Oh, the advertisements. I mean, well, the American culture, and that I have the Arab and Chaldean culture actually I have. So that was what played role in that poem. For example, just one line here I recall. I'm not going to read, of course, this long poem, but like, for example, well, I can't find it, I'm sorry. But, but there was a line that I wanted to read to you. Anyway, so it is inspired from viewpoint of an immigrant in this country. And my fiancé was in Australia, and I wanted to bring him here. So we had this was a complicated issue. So it's like a love poem also, in addition. And it's an interesting story how my husband, he was my fiancé in Baghdad, and then he escaped the war, he went to Australia, and I went to America, and we met after 12 years, so we got married so our marriage was delayed after 12 years. But you know what? And I have a poem called Lost and Found Husbands. And you know what? It's not uncommon. In the times of war, it's not uncommon to have lost and found husbands. Thanks.
There it is, bud. I think we have just these two quick
This is
breaks.
for
Kanan can have to
Kanan.
leave in a minute.
Oh, this is for
So if you
Kanan.
have anything to him, this is your
No.
last chance.
You spoke about Susan Sontag's essay and how shocked, offended you were by the absence of a reference to Saddam Hussein's reign of torture. But had she referred to this reign of torture, would that have mitigated or justified what we did at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, and what we continue to do there?
Not in any way, shape, or form. I hope I've made that clear. My dilemma was precisely the one that said to myself, one ought to be writing about both of these things at the same time, and I don't know how to do it. She obviously didn't either, but it seems to me the right thing to do in writing about this, especially given the context of the piece. But no, absolutely, there's no mitigation whatsoever, not in any way. It simply creates a dilemma where previously a person like myself might not have had one. That's my point.
Could I ask Kanan a very quick question? Why do you think you couldn't connect Americans torturing Iraqis at Abu Ghraib to Iraqis torturing Iraqis at Abu Ghraib? I mean, what do you think is the logical connection? In other words, what do you feel is the reason that logically must be mentioned? Because you can't understand Americans torturing Iraqis unless you see it as some sort of necessary cost to get rid of the Iraqis torturing Iraqis. Why must the two be mentioned together?
Look, precisely because the United States came to Iraq, ended up in Abu Ghraib on the basis of the kinds of claims that we're talking about, democracy and all the other, language and rhetoric, and American soldiers end up in the practice, good intentions run amok, so to speak, end up doing those kinds of torture, practicing those kinds of torture, in a country where that is so saturated, so much part of the public culture that people, and so where the levels to which it has descended, so to speak, is so barbaric, that you simply have to bring the two together, it seems to me, as a citizen of the world, as a writer. And that is, if you are not being a polemicist. I mean, I was accused, if one is not making simply a polemical point, if one is not simply scoring a point that one has a preordained position on something, the war is good, the war is bad, or whatever that may be, and wants to make a point, then you could use the Abu Ghraib purpose. But from a writerly point of view, where the full complexity of the world is supposed to be on your table and you're trying somehow to internalize it and bring it out in a way that makes sense, that, it seems to me, is a problem that you almost cries out to you in the Abu Ghraib business, just even from the point of view of place. Maybe it's the architects speaking in here. I don't know. This place breathes torture. It happened there. You want the history of Abu Ghraib and the practices in Abu Ghraib and what the Americans did in Abu Ghraib are of a piece at that particular moment when the great liberating army of the United States is coming with this project in particular in mind and so on. So it seems to me really, really impossible to avoid.
Prison was built by an American company, by the way, and you can see the American slogans on various parts of the equipment.
Now, I know we've had one very patient person here, and a young woman, so if you have one quick question, we can then...
Oh, thank you. Yeah, actually, I guess this is for Mark Danner and Pankaj Mishra. For one thing, I mean, I'm sort of surprised.
I'm just going to interrupt quickly to thank Kanan for coming, because he has to go.
I really do have to say
It's good to see you.
No, Kanan.
Now we're going back to the ultimate ultimate question. And here it is.
Yeah, a question relating to something Mark Downer said as I came in, I'm afraid, about journalists having a choice of going around in a soft car or a hard car. And I guess something that I'm always surprised that journalists never seem to consider, and especially it hasn't been raised at all here in a talk on writing and language, is, well, your other choice is to learn Arabic. Not everyone is born knowing it. It's possible to learn it. Not all Americans also are blonde and pink-skinned and can't pass in Iraq. It's quite possible to interview people in their own language and get different responses than you would get if you use a translator. And I'm appalled, as someone who's been to Iraq. I was in Iraq in May and June of 2003, and I'm appalled at how few of the reporters, especially those who lean most heavily on the leg of multiculturalism and consider themselves people of the left, bother to show the respect for the culture they often spend a great deal of time in terms of learning their beautiful and complicated language. That's one question for these two gentlemen. And the second issue I'd like them to discuss is, well, especially in a multicultural society such as Iraq, isn't imperialism really just one more form of multiculturalism? I mean, the most devastating invasion of Iraq was by the Mongols. Iraq was then conquered by the Turks. Many people living in Iraq today are of Turkish descent. Their families came and worked for the Turks. There are Saudis living in Iraq. There are Jordanians living in Iraq. It was, of course, famously formed from 3 provinces of the old Ottoman Empire. So where does one come off? Where do you draw the lines exactly? Who is the imperialist aggressor or the colonialist here? So, and I just would also say that I'm very surprised that Dunya did not mention that Saddam systematically rolled back the existing legal freedoms of Iraqi women. Saddam rolled back many of the laws to the days of Sharia law. He reduced the, I think it was the age of consent for marriage. He forbade women to travel outside of Iraq without their mahram. He also, I believe, changed some of the rape laws. I mean, there was a whole systematic dismantling of an existing relatively liberal and secular structure. Thank you.
Well, on the multicultural question, I'm not sure that analysis would comfort Iraqis any more than it would have under the Mongol invasion. I don't think there'll be many Iraqis of American extraction as a result of this occupation, because Americans, of course, don't see Iraqis except through the windows of their Humvees. The bases are very separate. There's very little consorting, and I don't know what to say about thinking of the invasion as a multinational or multicultural phenomenon. As far as speaking Arabic and hard cars and soft cars, reporters, whether they speak Arabic or not, are being kidnapped and killed in Iraq. About 60 of them have been killed thus far. A couple hundred foreigners, not all of them reporters, have been kidnapped. Some of them beheaded, some of them returned, some of them are still in captivity. So the reporting on the place, despite the outrage about lack of multicultural sensitivity, is dangerous for reasons other than having to do with whether or not reporters speak Arabic. I know quite a number who do, and who indeed have to still make the decision about whether to have security people with them and go in armored cars, or whether to try to be inconspicuous, because blending in really is not an option, because the reporter does things that essentially draw attention to him or her. And as far as, I essentially chose most of the time to try to be inconspicuous, which meant for my translator, and I don't speak Arabic, he would say to me, pretend you're asleep when I was in the backseat of the car. Somehow he thought this was inconspicuous. And one day in very heavy Baghdad traffic, I heard we were stuck in traffic and the driver said something very grimly under his breath to the translator, and I said, "What did he say?" And the translator reluctantly told me that he said, "Bad to sit in traffic with foreigner in car." So these things, I would love to, I wish I spoke Arabic and have been trying to learn some of it, but I don't think this, alas, depends on fluency in the language, though I agree that that's important, but I wish it surmounted all difficulties in Iraq now. It doesn't.
Now, do we have some final comments? I think Dunya should have the last word, but how about you?
I never thought multiculturalism was so wonderful anyway, but especially if it can include imperialism. I think it's probably not very useful. But I think the language, I agree with Mark, it's not enough to master a language, and you have to master a whole lot of other stuff. And of course, you're immediately identified because of your white skin, and it's very hard to conceal that. So I think the limitations on people covering these stories in Iraq are real, and I don't think they can simply be transcended by learning Arabic or even acquiring a Baghdad accent.
A hard accent to acquire, by the way.
Yeah, well, to the lady who was surprised that why I didn't mention what Saddam did regarding, Iraqi women, if I mention everything, I would keep you here until tomorrow. And I myself experienced something about that. I mean, that's how my career was shaped, because when I graduated, I'll try also to be quick, sorry. Graduated from high school, my father thought that I was too smart maybe for Iraqi schools, and I was very good in math. He said, okay, you gotta go study math in America, and he was so rich, my father, so he got me admission here at his expenses. And then the Iraqi law, by that time in the year, it was in the beginning of 80s, in the beginning of 80s, that ban, when I went to get permission to leave, they said no, women cannot leave Iraq at their expenses unless we send them, at our expenses. So, but the gentleman said, okay, but this, this will change maybe next year. So when I went home, I told my father, he said, you know what, okay, let's, I go, instead of instead of going in the engineering college, go to the English department so you get prepared for 1 year, study English. So when you go to America, be prepared. I said, oh, that's a good idea. Went first year, second year went to the same law, so I went second year, third, I graduated. That's why I am, and then I came here, I continued, I liked that field, so it was not by choice, but that's one of the things that happened, and other things that were very interesting. I will not keep you here for telling you all the stories, but I am aware of this.
But you've given us a sense of Iraqi reality, and we're very grateful, and to all our